It is my great pleasure to welcome to the classroom a fella whose colonized name, anyway, is Jay Mason. He'll be speaking to us based on his perspectives and his experiences, I'll leave it to him to tell you about himself and to introduce himself further. But he joins us from the Bear Clan of the Mohawk Nation, people of the Longhouse. And it is a pleasure to have you here to share your knowledge with us. Thank you. Please welcome colonizing Jay Mason.
Okay, don't applaud because you might not like what I'm saying. No. This is my son. This is my youngest son, JJ Hawk. He likes to be called Hawk. He's 15 years old. He's here to begin his university education. And my good friend Vita has been my sister for many, many years. She just helped me set up a Facebook page, so I want to honor her for that. And my name is Yunandahare. Can everybody say that? Yunandahare. Yunandahare. My colonized name is Jay Mason, which doesn't mean too much, but Yunandahare means the lone pine tree on top of the mountain with his roots deep in the earth. So I guess when those old clan mothers named me, they must have seen how I was, because they knew that it doesn't matter what they throw at me, they can't tear me from my roots. So that's how I come by that name. There's a whole story around that too, but that's for another time. That's for story time. But each name, there's other elements to it why they give that name, you know. And then Bear Clan. We talk about our clans. Within the Mohawk Nation, we have 3 clans. We have Wolf, Bear, and Turtle. And how that works is that's more or less that's your extended family. So if I'm Bear Clan and I meet maybe somebody I take a liking to and she's Bear Clan, we can't have anything to do with each other because that would be like with your cousins. You know, so it has to be from another clan. So it was a way that we had too of ensuring that cleanliness of the gene pool, you know. There was a natural flow to that. And another thing that helped that is we are a matriarchal society. Our clan comes from our mother. When you're born, you belong to your mother's clan, not to your father's clan. And when you ask those old ladies, those old clan mothers, why that is, they say because we're the only ones that know for sure. No. But it's because in the language, there's no word for woman. The word for woman has nothing to do with gender. The word for woman, it would mean the one who carries the path. And then the word for me, it doesn't mean man. The word for me is roteskanagate, and it means the one who carries the burden. So the words don't describe a gender, rather they describe a responsibility, right? And what they mean, the one who carries the path, that's the generations, right? And it's my job to make sure that those generations ensure any decision that I have to make, I have to consider not how is it going to impact on him. I have to consider how it's going to impact on my 7th generation down the road. And that's within our laws. And this is important for people to understand, which we'll get to a little bit later. But something else I wanted to talk about was this whole thing about racialization and that. Does everybody know what discrimination is? Is racism discrimination? Are racism and discrimination the same thing? They're not? What's the difference? What is the difference?
Discrimination dehumanizes.
And what's the difference between that and racism?
Well, race is towards particular. Racialization is basically like talking about race and ethnicity and different cultures, right? And then discrimination is towards it's towards a certain population, like it's directive.
All right, that's good, but let me make it easy. The difference, racism has a political agenda. Racism is discrimination with that difference. Racism has a political agenda. The agenda of racism is to ensure and maintain the power of the status quo. Sexism is the same thing. Sexism is discrimination with the same political agenda. That is the difference. See how it works, right? Is you get these people and they're not doing that good. You know, they don't got quite as much money, but it's okay. At least you're better off than them. See, so then they're not resisting against the ones that have the money because they're too busy looking down on the ones that are different from them, thereby helping to maintain the power of that status quo. See, those things have a political agenda, and that's what we have to remember and understand. I had somebody tell me one time when I was speaking that I was a reverse racist, and I said, you're wrong. It's impossible for me to be a racist. The most I can aspire to is a bigot. And the reason is because my status quo isn't in power. And I don't want to make the trade. You know, I don't want to have equal rights so to be a racist. It's not about that for me. So that's the thing to understand. You know, that's what makes racism such a dangerous tool. The same with sexism. It has a political agenda. And we have to understand that. The other thing is how many people, everybody is a Canadian citizen. Is that true or? Okay, what about the law? Now, if your children are born in this country, are they a Canadian citizen? And that's partly why a lot of people come, because they know that, you know, there's a better chance for their children to do good for themselves and build better generations, you know. So they want to come here. So your child is born here, automatically they're a Canadian citizen. Well, I'm going to tell you, I was born in Toronto, not far from here, St. Michael's Hospital in 1952. So I should have been a Canadian citizen, right? I wasn't a Canadian citizen until 1958. Now, everybody in this country has a right to a post-secondary education. Is that right? It was illegal for me to go to university when I was born. These are some of the things that this racism has done. Prior to 1958, we weren't even considered humans. We were wards of the government. 1958 was when Canada decided to pass citizenship for us. Of course, they didn't ask us, they did it unilaterally, but it wasn't until 1958 that I was considered a citizen of this country, even though I was born here in 52, even though my parents had been born here and their parents, down to the first generation, had been born here. But we were not citizens of this country. Prior to 1958, it was against the law for a Native person to go to school past the age of 15 or to receive a post-secondary education. It was against the law for a Native person to leave the reserve without permission from the Indian agent or the priest. It was against the law for more than 3 Indian people to gather in a public place. It was against the law for an Indian person to own a machinery, to own a tractor or farm machinery and to sell his agricultural produce. It was against the law for Native people to hire a lawyer or for a lawyer to represent Native people. Does any of this sound familiar to anybody? If it does, it's probably because in the 1930s, the South African government came to Canada and studied these laws, studied the reservation system, went back and called it apartheid in 1948. This is where they came to learn how it was done. We're still about the only people in this country that have to carry a separate identification. This is called a native status card. And basically it says, yeah, he's an Indian. But those are some things about Canada and about racism and what it's done, how it's impacted on us, right? So 1958, they finally passed that Canadian citizenship, so they have to start changing the other things. So 1960, that came the vote and the right to own business and private property. 1965 came the right to post-secondary education and the provincial vote. And that's why Canada owes that fiduciary responsibility to our peoples for that education, because they had denied it for so long. You know, some of you might read newspapers and read some of the things that some of these other racist peoples talk about, how Indian people get free education and free this and free that. Well, I just saw my brother here put some figures on the board that pretty much disputed a lot of that stuff. There are communities in northern Canada that are living in poverty, that are living in the same third world conditions as other places around the world. And Canada is in denial and doesn't want to admit what they're doing. You know, instead they want to point the finger at, oh, look at what's happening over there and look at what's happening over there. But over here in Canada, everybody is so happy. But what about the Indians? What about those little kids that are living in tar paper shacks up north with no running water, without a proper school, or without the chance to an education to even learn about their situation? And this is what Canada keeps denying. I was really, really glad. I've been reading the past couple of weeks that there was a UN delegation come over and finally looking into these things. Finally looking into these things. Of course, I don't have much hope other than that those ones that are doing that their humanness will come through, but I don't have any hope from the United Nations body as a whole. I just received a Facebook message from an old friend of mine in Holland. He's Klingwa. He's a remnant of the Carib peoples. He's from Suriname, which used to be known as Dutch Guyana. It's now called Suriname. It was the area that the English traded for what used to be called New Amsterdam, which is now New York City. So that goes back to the 1600s, how long that the Dutch have been down there. And he was sharing me his concerns, how very few of his people are left that speak their language. And he's very concerned that his grandchildren won't know their language, that their language might disappear, you know. And there's peoples like that all over the world that I'm in touch with, and it kind of makes me feel, you know, look at our situation here. At least we've got a few more peoples that still have our language yet, you know. I really felt bad talking to my brother about that, worried. But he sent me an old picture that was taken in 1994 in Holland. It was a picture of myself and him. There were Moluccans, there were Papua, there were Quechua, there were people from the Philippines, all indigenous peoples. People from Venezuela, from Ecuador. There was about 10 different nations from around, indigenous nations from around that world. We were all together at this symposium. We're all creating a united front with each other. And for me, remembering that was beautiful, you know. We all understood each other. We spoke different languages. But it was those shared experiences that made us come together, and we understood each other, even without speaking the same language. We knew what we were talking about. We knew what each other was feeling. You know? So looking at that United Nations, what we're trying to do, we're sitting there and we're talking about, you know, if our peoples have to come together. And what I was doing, I was trying to promote the idea that we need our own United Nations of indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples make up 60% of the world population. And that's 60% of the world population with no voice in that United Nations. So I was talking about we need to come together and start developing our own United Nations of indigenous peoples. And some peoples we're talking about, we need to be trying to find our own seat and get a seat in that United Nations alongside of them. But they changed and they started understanding that, yeah, we have to make our own United Nations when I pointed out, well, wait a minute. The United Nations is made up of our colonizers. Are our colonizers going to let us have an equal seat at their table? You know, so people start understanding, no, that's not going to happen. And that's what it's about. It's about finding that dignity. It's about finding that justice. You know, there can't be any justice until that dignity gets returned. And 60% of the world's population are indigenous peoples with no voice. So I started looking and understanding this. And so I looked at those laws that I talked about and what was happening there. And I saw when things started to change. After World War I, there were all of these Native veterans started coming back who had joined to help in that war. Per capita, there was about 45% of Canadians participated in the effort of World War I. Per capita, it was over 80% of Native people participated. I used to talk to some of those old veterans, and when I was younger, I wanted to know, well, why did you go and fight for them with what they were doing to our peoples? And they said, we didn't fight for them. They said, we fought to prove that this was our country. So that's why I honor and respect those warriors. Because they did what they had to do. They were making decisions that they could see that was only available to them. But when they started returning, they had a newer awakening. There was an epiphany of what was their second-class situation on their own land. So they started organizing in little pockets here and there. But it was hard because it was illegal for more than 3 Indians to gather in a public place. But this organization, it kept growing. And what was happening out this way in East, not too far from here near Brantford, there's Six Nations Reserve. And that's where my mother's people are from. Now we have a different relationship. We have treaties that go back to the 1600s with Britain. So following World War I, the British sent a gift of bread and cheese to the Six Nations. Don't ask me why bread and cheese, because I don't know. I just know that we still call Victoria Day Bread and Cheese Day because of that. And the reason that we still remember that is because along with that gift came a proclamation from the British Crown. And that proclamation thanked the Six Nations for their alliance in the war against Germany. It didn't thank us for our service. It thanked us for our alliance, because those were in the treaties. We never were subservient. We said, we'll be your ally. We are not your subject. And so that proclamation became very important, because in Geneva, the League of Nations was forming. The League of Nations was made up of the World War I allies. So there was a man named Descahe, Wolf Clan, Cayuga from Six Nations. His English name was Levi General, or his colonized name. He went to Geneva seeking the Six Nation Iroquois seat at the table of the Allies, with that proclamation saying, we're one of the Allies. At that time, Ireland, Panama, Estonia, and Persia supported his petition to become a member of the League of Nations. When Canada found out, Canada sent a letter. Mackenzie King was Prime Minister of Canada. Mackenzie King stated that Indian peoples were outside the competence and jurisdiction of the international body because they are a domestic concern of the government of Canada. And that became important because in 1948, when the United Nations formed out of the League of Nations, Article 71A in their charter says that the United Nations cannot interfere in matters of a domestic concern of their member nations. And all indigenous peoples are a domestic concern of their colonizing governments. So how can I go and ask for a seat at their table when Canada's going to say Article 718? Where's the justice for us when Canada can say Article 718? Australia can say Article 718. New Zealand can say Article 718, etc. And again, it comes down to racism. That shows that right across the board that we are still not recognized as peoples. It's only been recently that they finally managed to change that name. From 1993 to 96, I guess, was the last time I went. I was going to the sessions in Geneva, to the conference on indigenous populations. And that's what they were calling it. And the big thing that we were arguing about was no, right from the start. That has to say Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. The rights of indigenous peoples, not the rights of indigenous populations. The black fly is an indigenous population. The caribou is an indigenous population. We are the animal that walks on two legs. We are peoples. And the biggest holdouts was Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand did not want that word changed to peoples. Because once they start doing that, they have to start according us the rights as peoples. See, so this study of racism is really important when you start understanding how it works and how it's thrown out there. You know, why is it that we have to argue to be recognized as peoples? In what's supposed to be an international body for world justice. And they don't want to give us that recognition. That's because it's all made up of all the colonizers. And we have to understand that. You know? And I've been doing this for a long time. I started in my late teens to start standing up and try understanding what was going on. The first thing I did was I put away white man's poison. I quit using alcohol because I wanted to change things. But I'm a high school dropout. I got no education. I was only 20 years old. The only thing I knew was I didn't like what was going on. The only thing I knew was things had to change. I didn't know how to change it. I didn't know what would work, but I knew what wasn't working. Right? So I put this away. It helped me to be more clear-minded. This old Mohawk chief told me a warrior's strongest weapon is his mind. So I started being able to learn how to come and to talk to groups like this. I started learning how to absorb that information. I started realizing that the school system was wrong, that I wasn't just a stupid Indian. My only problem was that their colonial consumer training program was an impediment to the edification of my education. And I didn't really start becoming educated until I got out of there. And then I was able to start learning and educating myself and on my own. So I started learning that I did know something. I was capable of learning. I was capable of absorbing and presenting information and organizing it in a concise manner. And as a high school dropout, I've been able to take it to their capitals and challenge them. You know, and I say that because I want each and every one of you to know that you're not powerless. You know, you can empower yourself. There are things that you can do. We don't have to just sit silently. And this is just some of my thoughts on racism, coupled in with some international affairs. A little bit of things that's happening across Canada. One of the things that I've been talking about lately with the young people is that for us as Native peoples to understand that we're engaged in a war. It's a war that started in 1607. And people who don't believe that we are engaged in a war, just look what happened out in Micmac country recently. Just open up Indian news and see what's happening around the country. See how many Native people are getting beaten up by the police every day or getting killed in their prisons. There's a war that they don't like to admit that they're engaged in. And it's a war not of our choosing. And it's hard. It's hard to say that, you know, because I come from a people, we like to be peaceful. We're good fighters. We know how to fight, but that's not how we're supposed to be. You know, that's only how we're supposed to look after our peoples and defend our peoples if we have to. We're not supposed to have to live in that constant state. And we've been forced to live in that since the 1600s. You stop and consider when Columbus came and Columbus landed in the Caribbean, there were over 20 million Tainos, Caribs, Arawaks on those Caribbean islands. Over 20 million. Within 20 years of Columbus landing, there was only 20,000 left. And now there's very few, but some bloodlines left in some of the peoples that are there. What peoples are left there's some in Puerto Rico yet, and there's a few Caribs and Tainos, Caribs and Arawaks in Guyana and Suriname and French Guyana, which is where my friend was from, who's concerned about his language. He's Kalingwa, he's one of the Carib peoples. And their language is disappearing fast, and he's concerned about that. He worries about that. And I understand his worry. I feel for him. I wish I could help him, but all I can do is encourage him and, be his brother. But that was a Holocaust, from 20 million to 20,000. In North America, there used to be 80 to 100 million Native peoples. We're down to about 7 million from Alaska to the Mexican border. 7 million from 80 to 100. What happened to all my relatives? That was a Holocaust. We were the victims of the first Holocaust. And yet when I talk about these things, I grew up trying to learn and understand and have discussions and talk about these things. And your average Canadian would tell me, well, quit living in the past. Forget about it. Live in the past. Don't do that. Get over it. Quit living in the past. And they used to make me feel guilty about trying to express what I was feeling about these things. I was made to feel guilty for that, blaming the victim again. Just like his one chart he was showing up there. Well, look at how those Indians are. Look at how they are, those Indians. See, it's their fault. Blaming the victim. Well, how come those Indians ain't educated? Never mind the fact that it was illegal. Blame the victim. Well, how come that Indian ain't working? Well, because he can't get a job, stupid. I spoke to a women's group one time about these things. And before I spoke, they were talking about employment equity and how women are at this level and men are at this level when it comes to pay. And I understand that. And I stood up and I agreed. I said, that's true. I said, except when you look at our community. When you look at our community, women are at this level, men are at this level, Indian men are down here. So you can't say all men. Our people are way down there. You look at those figures he showed on the prison rates. Indian girls go to school, Indian boys go to jail. We make up less than 4% of the population, but we make up over 45% of the inmate population. What's up with that? Does that mean we're all criminals? Does that mean we're all bad guys and you can't trust us? Watch out, I'm going to steal your wallet. There's something going on here. Something's got to change. you know? And I've done about as much as I can. I managed to put this away. I've managed to try and encourage other people to do that. I've managed to try and conduct myself in a good way, you know? I've managed to try and raise my children in a good way, you know? And that's about all I can do. Other people, I'm waiting for them to start picking that up. I'm getting tired. But I still think that we have to keep that education going up. And there's so many other things that are happening. These are what was on my mind recently, which is why I mentioned just these few things. You know, I haven't even talked about the forced sterilization of Indian women or the medical experiments that were done on our children in those boarding schools. Right? You know, 1948, the United Nations is formed. They also passed a law called the Geneva Convention on Genocide. Now, have you talked about the boarding schools and some of the things that happened there? No? None of that stuff yet? Well, that Geneva Convention on Genocide, it says the acts that constitute the crime of genocide. Killing members of a group or race of people is genocide. Imposing measures that prevent births within a group or race of people is genocide. Removing children from one group or of people to another is genocide. Depriving a group or race of people of their culture, heritage, religion, language is genocide. Imposing measures that bring about psychological and or physical harm is genocide. Now, when you start learning about those boarding schools, you'll see right there, it's all covered there. Right? They passed that Geneva Convention on Genocide, and that was used to bring Nazi war criminals to trial for war crimes and for acts of genocide. They're bringing those people to trial for those war crimes. You know what? Canada was doing the same thing to our parents. The same things that those Nazis were doing was being done to our children back then. I read a book once about the USS Pueblo. It was a naval ship that was captured by the North Koreans, and it described what they called the brainwashing techniques that the American soldiers were subjected to before they were released. I read those, and that sent a chill up my back, because what they were described was almost word for word what my mom told me was said to her. They were brainwashing our peoples. They were committing war crimes. They've been committing genocide, forced sterilization of Indian peoples. And this was going on into the 1980s. And nobody knows. Canada won't admit it. United States won't admit it. You know? And for me, there can't be any rest yet until I see that. It's not that I want Canada to go to jail or nothing like that. But I want it acknowledged. I want it recognized that this was done and that Canada was wrong. And they're living in denial. You know, how can we return our dignity without that? And this is some of the racism that happens to Native peoples. But my studies haven't only been there, they've been in other avenues too. Did you know that 75% of all the vegetables in the world came from Native peoples? Every kind of bean in the world except for 2 that came from China came from Native peoples. Tapioca came from Native peoples. Cotton, rubber, peanuts, chewing gum, chocolate came from Native peoples. The cotton that we use today was what they found growing in Native peoples. The Spaniards write that the cloth was so fine when they first seen it, they thought it was silk. And that's what they exported. That's now being grown around the world, but they call it South Sea cotton or India cotton. But that came from this part of the world here. They had a coarser, rougher cotton over there. And it came from here, tobacco. I know people have different feelings about tobacco, but I really find that kind of sanctimonious myself. North America made its fortune on the tobacco trade, and now they're all standing up and they're saying, oh, that's bad, we can't smoke cigarettes. It's almost a little hypocritical when I see all of that, but that one makes me laugh. The other one that I saw is the whole business about fur trade. Canada made its fortune on the fur trade. And now the descendants of those Canadians are walking around going, oh, we got to save the furry critters. We can't hurt them. You know, well, you weren't thinking about that 400 years ago, 500 years ago. Another one is, well, those Mohawk Indians are smugglers. You might have read that or seen that on the news or read that in the papers around the whole cigarette issue. You know, we're not smugglers. We're using the same rivers and routes that we used when we were running the furs for them. You know, we weren't smugglers then. You know, that's our take on it. We've got a little bit different take on these things, you know. We're just trying to get by. We're trying to survive. We're trying to feed our families. We're trying to look after things any way we can. There's not enough opportunities out there. This whole racism, I mean, we looked at that with what I talked about, the animal rights movements and that. One thing that I looked at, you know, at one time, you might have a man way up north, he could go out and he'd have his area, his territory, and he'd check his trap line. And maybe he might find a lynx, and he could take that lynx back and he could skin and he could clean that, and he could get about $5,000 for that fur. $5,000 went a long way towards feeding his family. Now he's lucky if he can get $10. Now, okay, sure, some people might be saying, yeah, but we're saving the little furry critters. But you know what? That man is now forced to leave his territory to come into an urban area like this in order to try and feed his family. Now there's nobody on that land to protect it from the resource developers, from the loggers. But these people, they don't think about that. But I see that. I see it as a concerted effort to remove our peoples from the land. If we can't make our living off the land anymore, we're forced to come into these areas and there's no one to protect the land. And then what happens in these areas? There's drug addiction, there's crime, there's alcoholism, there's prostitution, and all these other traps and pitfalls that people start falling into when that quiet desperation, tugging at the depths of their soul, and they find themselves walking the streets of Babylon at night, seeking confrontation just to ease the raging in their spirit. I just made that up. You know, but there's many issues. You know, he talked about the homeless issue. And that one really bugs me. You know, because there's natural law. Some people might say God, some people might say the Creator. We talk about the Creator. And we know that the Creator made everything on this earth. But we also know that the Creator gave everything duties and responsibilities, and the Creator also gave everything rights. Every bird has a right to his nest. Every rabbit has a right to his burrow. Every fox has a right to his den. Every deer herd has the right to their yard. So if the Creator gave those rights, why are there so many homeless out there? That's not the Creator's fault, that's man-made law. You know, my father used to talk about that. He used to say we have to do something because the Creator's law is being broken. There shouldn't be any homeless out there. The Creator gave everything the right to have that warm, safe place to go and sleep. Yet there's homeless out there because of man-made laws. It shouldn't be like that. You know, we talk about natural law. We talk about original instructions. You know, this young man here, he has original instructions. The first 7 years of his life, I allowed him to follow those instructions. For the first 7 years of his life, he only had to do a few things. He had to grow while it worked. He had to learn, he had to play, and he had to have fun. It was by playing and having fun that he learned, that helped his growth. And those are instructions from the Creator. Those are the instructions to every small living creature. You know, I had to mention that because I had to talk to his school. They were worried about him not doing his homework. I said, well, I didn't even know he was getting homework. When I went to school, we didn't get homework till grade 3 or 4. You know, and he's only in grade 1, and they're telling me he's not doing his homework. And so then I told him, I said, well, I got to be honest. I'm not going to be too worried about his homework. I told him he's got instructions. And I told him what those were. And I said, and he's going to do that for those first 7 years of his life. And didn't I allow that? When he turned 8 years old, all by himself, he started coming home and going in his room and sitting down and doing his homework right away. He was reaching that age of reason, see? So I know that those natural laws have a place, and that's what I work for. You know? Man-made laws, they can't supersede those. Man-made laws is what causes racism. I'll tell you something I want you to think about. 1492, when Columbus came to those Caribbean islands. Now in North America, at 1492, there wasn't an Indian in North America had a job. Think about it. Nobody had a job. But we had social order. We had trade networks. We had functioning, healthy societies. We had safe communities. Our children didn't have to worry about being abused. Our women didn't have to be worried about being raped. We had trade networks that stretched from Alaska right down to South America. There's a story that we talk about up this way. We talk about that the Mayans were the scientists. That any people in the world could go, in North America, could go to the Mayans and tell them where they lived, and they would be given seeds that would grow and crops that they could farm in their country. 75% of the world's vegetables came from native peoples. Those Mayans had a big part to do with that. Just think what the culinary arts of the world would be without tomatoes or chilies. Tomatoes and chilies came from native people. You wouldn't have pizza, you wouldn't have spaghetti sauce, you know. You wouldn't have tacos. What they call Mexican food, it's mostly Indian food. It came from native peoples down there. The government, well, I talked a little bit about the government. You know, they had the Congress of Albany about 1654 or 16, somewhere down there. 1764, I mean, that's right. And at the Congress of Albany was when they sat down and they started drafting up the United States Declaration of Independence. And in attendance, they had Iroquois chiefs. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, they stood up and argued that the form of government that the Iroquois had should be adopted for the new Union. And they had Iroquois chiefs there to advise them how to start writing up the Articles of Independence. And that's a fact, it's documented. They took that form of government from our peoples. After that American Revolution, that concept spread to France. And they had a similar revolution to enact a similar form of government that they had learned also. You had people like Thomas Paine and Rousseau and other intellectual thinkers in Europe at that time writing about what they were seeing in native cultures and native societies. Not too long after, there were a couple of other people. They read a book called The League of the Iroquois by Lewis Henry Morgan. Their names were Marx and Engels. They started writing their treatises on social order that later became known as socialism and communism. The two greatest governments in the world today had their roots in our people.